Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. So John Gordon, Senior Counsel, on behalf of Nikita Hand, summed up for the jury on what their case was to the court. And of course, the mainstay of that case is that she has said she was raped by Conor McGregor the day after her Christmas party in December 2018, and that she is also looking for compensation for a rape by James Lawrence, which, look, is very a complex matter because, of course, she has also told the court she doesn't believe she ever had sex with James Lawrence. James Lawrence gave the police a statement saying he had sex with her the day after Conor McGregor was arrested in January of 2019. And before that, there was no suggestion that she and Mr. Lawrence had been together, be it consensually or not.
Yes, that's correct. And yesterday's episode, we heard from his senior counsel's closing statement, and also the closing statement from Conor McGregor's legal team. But yesterday after lunch, we got the closing statement from Mr. Gordon, who is Nikita Hand's senior counsel. This was about an hour and 40 minutes in length. There was a significant portion of that closing statement that featured the ins and outs of the finances in relation to the claims and her damages. And we will touch on it a little bit, but we won't go into it too much because the majority of it was him rehashing the evidence that we've already spoke about.
And the accountants and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. So he began his closing statement by saying, in just over 2 weeks now, you've heard a lot of evidence. You've witnessed stress, some anger, and some vitriol. You've witnessed what I will suggest to you is serial lying. But he said, I'll come to all of that at the end. He said this morning, Mr. Farrell, in his evidence, said that there would be refutable evidence. So these are the pieces of evidence, he said, around which a jury will construct it and consider its overall case. He said, sadly, by far, Mr. Farrell is short of islands. In his closing statement said that there would be an island of proof. He said he was short of islands and made a virtue out of the CCTV as such. He said in a throwaway line, he mentioned that other people around the hotel, and this is in relation to the CCTV, he said other people around the hotel didn't seem to have any issue about what they saw when they came and went. But on the other side of that, Mr. Farrell never chose to call any member of staff for the hotel. So this is in relation to the other people in the CCTV footage who, one of them even interacted with Nikita Hand and James Lawrence in the lift. But he said, despite using this throwaway line, he never actually requested anyone, member of staff, to come and give evidence. And he said also there was only one member of Mr. McGregor's security team. He said, you're entitled to ask yourself why. He said, of course, the cameras don't lie, but they don't tell the whole story either. And again, he said, watch this matter for yourself. And come to your own conclusions. He then went on to describe the CCTV, saying, it'll be clear to you that this lady was not in good shape. He said, and to come back to my friend's island analogy, he said, there's of course a rock sitting in the middle of the case, which both my friend sail around. So he's referring to the closing statements by both James Lawrence's senior counsel and of course by Conor McGregor senior counsel. He said, they do this because they can't face the rock. And he said, what is the rock? He said, on the evening on the 9th of December 2018, my client was badly beaten up, and the best that Mr. Farrell can come up with is suggest that there are inconsistencies and lies in her account to her partner. Initially, Mr. McGregor was making the case that this was just for fun. He was having rough sex. He said not even rough sex, athletic sex is how he described it. And he said, of course, in his evidence to this court, he changed his story. His evidence now is, and he said it more than once, there was no tampon. None of this happened. There was even a little trip, he said, into the possibility that there was a third man between the hotel and when she ended up at Emer's house. He said, it's a significant that a lot of Mr. McGregor's evidence was not put to his client, he said, which would be the normal procedure. He said his solicitor presented his case in accordance with Mr. McGregor's instruction, that he was given instruction on the case from him. Obviously said it was the demeanour of Mr. McGregor, who obviously thought that as the case was approaching, that there was going to be a problem over the tampon in relation to the severity of the injuries. He then brings us back to the 4th of February, which is when Nikita Hand became aware for the first time that James Lawrence had said that he had had sex with her. He said, in the meantime, Mr. McGregor had interviews with the Gardaí on the 17th of January 3 times. During that period, much of the CCTV stuff, the injuries sustained and the photographs were all shown to him. He made a short statement that was prepared with the solicitor on the 17th of January at 12 p.m. that day. It wasn't until he seen all of this material he came back to his 4th interview, which was in the early hours of the 18th of January. So that was, the early hours of the 18th of January was 12:07 a.m. And at this point, he gave a statement which he read out, which of course was read out before in the course of the case. And he said in the statement that he was shocked at the injuries and he didn't do it, but he specified that somebody else did. He said, of course, at that point, Mr. McGregor, for the first time, had to face up to what he had done because he did it. And he said, and what he did was savage. He then went on to say, to draw the jury's memory back to the evidence from Ethna Scully, the lady who drove the ambulance. And in her evidence, she described it as one of the worst cases she had ever seen. And this is in relation to the bruising. He then said, think of Dr. Kane, who said it was one of the worst cases he had ever seen. The tampon was wedged up into the far end of this lady's vagina. He said, let's put it this way. Somebody did it. It happened in the Beacon Hotel and it was Mr. McGregor. He said, you'll have noticed at one point, after having given bland evidence on the stand for quite some time, and this is in relation to Conor McGregor's testimony, he said the mask slipped. He lost his temper and he said, and what did you witness? He said, a stream of invective aimed at my client across the courtroom. He said, what does that tell you about Mr. McGregor? He said, you're not just making the decision based on the words of a document, but on the assessment of the demeanour of the witness, how they answer or didn't answer questions and how they respond in the witness box. He also said, can I bring you back to my client's recount that she's no angel? She was out for a good time and up to a certain point she was having a great time, but then it went badly wrong as far as she's concerned. She went to a hotel with Mr. McGregor and foolishly perhaps done so. He said that she advised him that she didn't want to have sex with him, and she gave a number of reasons. The first of all was that there was a bit of a family connection there. She knew his partner D and used this to persuade his request. He then said that she had a tampon on and she explained that she wouldn't have sex while on her period or have sex with a tampon in. So he said, we know why she wouldn't have sex with him, and what she said tells us he wouldn't take no for an answer. He got her to the hotel where he'd laid plans for having a sex evening. He said at 4:30 a.m. the previous morning, his driver had booked the Beacon Hotel, and at that point he was in town in Crystal with a group of friends, and among them was 2 girls. He said in Crystal went on till 7:30 in the morning. The girls decided to go home, one of which he drove to her home in Clontarf. He said, so here he was at 7:30 or 8 in the morning with a suite booked and no girls. So that is why Nikita, as said in her evidence, she was surprised to hear from him so late in the evening. Of course, now it was morning, he said, but she was in fact the substitute, that it was not his original plan at all to go there with her, but in fact to go there with somebody else. He said, when you look at the manner in which this was put together, a reasonable inference was it was Mr. McGregor's intention to have sex. His protestations about staying in the hotel to use the gym, he said, was, and this is what Mr. Gordon said, he said it was, quote, nonsense and poppycock. He said that he'd left his own gym that day after having a good workout and said he would stay in the hotel after his night out to use the gym. He said that he now decides that he must drop in some new information about the occasion. He said on the stand that Miss Hand took a swan dive into the bath. He commented that she was out for 3 days and also said that she probably got knocked about an airfield or a pub or whatever. And then he said to the jury, thank goodness you're looking at this and you have the common sense to know you're being sold a pup by this arrogant man. He said, you really have to bear in mind that the islands are on this side of the courtroom and Mr. McGregor has, instead of dealing with it, ran away from it. And with regards to his demeanour in the courtroom, he said there's no answer to his appalling behaviour. He then went on to say, he went on to Mr. Lawrence. He said, Mr. Lawrence came forward after Mr. McGregor's interview with the guards. In Mr. Lawrence's evidence that he went to the solicitors within 2 or 3 days of this alleged incident happening. He said, we know that he went to the same solicitors and we know that Mr. McGregor has also paid for Mr. Lawrence's fees. He said, so we assume that Mr. Lawrence was in cahoots with Mr. McGregor from day one. He said, although he went to the solicitors within days, he did not show up with his little statement until the 18th of January. He said, it's at this point point, he drops in a little hand grenade that he had sex with my client as well. He describes it as soft sex, and he asked the jury, why would you use the word soft? He said, you're now aware, you've seen all the photographs that this lady has been badly beaten, and you throw in the word soft, just distance yourself from all of that, and at the same time confuse a narrative, and also to try and make her out to be a bigger hussy, is what he said. He then also went on to say that the liar here in this case was Mr. McGregor. He said he doesn't have the courage or the decency to own up to what he did. He said this is a man who lives by the media and thrives by the media. What he should have done, I would suggest you, if he was any man at all, was apologise to my client. But he's not a man. He's a coward. He's a devious coward, he also added, and you should treat him for what he is. He says, I want you to look at the photographs then. He produced exhibit 3, and he said we've had these photographs in the beginning, and he pointed the jury to look at the photograph of his client's breast. He said you will see there's a nasty scratch here. He said my client gave evidence that it happened when she had her hands up in front of her, trying to keep him off her, and he pressed down on top of her, and the result was that her watch scratched her breast. He said I would suggest that the only mechanism for this injury, for this to happen, is what she describes. Yet it was dismissed as a nothing. But he said it's not a nothing. It's a talisman. It's an island of evidence that corroborates my client's account of what took place. He said that she goes on to say how he put her in a stranglehold. And of course, he said there was plenty of corroborating evidence that he did just that. And her account of having done it on 3 occasions, and when she had basically, he said, surrendered, and she said, he had said to her, now you know what it was like in the octagon when I tapped out 3 times. He then pointed to the fact that Mr. McGregor had agreed that 2 months prior in Las Vegas, he had been beaten in a big match. And it was how he had, when he was beaten in said match, it was how he had tapped out because his opposition put him in a stranglehold. So he tapped out. He said, being a fighter, that's something that they do to surrender and lose the match, which he did. He said, so you can imagine what was going through Mr. McGregor's mind when he said that. He then said that he was in some temper and he was taking it out on his client, come hell or high water. He then said the idea that she went off in a matter of hours and made up the story is preposterous. She mentions it to her friend. And of course, her account as well as while he said it's all over the place, she's suffering from fragmented memories. Of course she was all over the place, he said. If someone did that to you, would you be cool, calm and collected? He said, no, you'd be in a terrible state. And she was in a terrible state. He then went on to say how he took her in a stranglehold, and that was something that would be embedded in her memory for the rest of her days. He then asked to bring them to the evidence of the ambulance crew from day 5. We heard from Mr. Dempsey and Miss Scully. When asked if they noticed anything about Miss Hand, Mr. Dempsey said that there was some visible marks on her in and around her throat, on her breast and thighs and stuff like that as well. In Miss Scully's evidence, she said there appeared to be some bruising around her neck, her lower neck. She said that she was wearing pajamas, but that's what she could see at that time. She also said it's the worst case she had ever seen. He said that this was irrefutable evidence, and the doctor said that she could palpate underneath Nikita Hand's skin that there was bruising on her neck. He then goes on to ask the jury to turn their attention to the plea deal briefly. He says, I want to do this to show you how this case was framed. He said the defendant's plea case is that the accusations are false, malicious and made in bad faith. She's looking for relocation fees and loss of earnings, which amounts to extortion. Mr. Gordon said, you've heard an evidence about the triggers that she suffers. You've heard no evidence from other side or any evidence that contravenes that. So you're entitled to accept the evidence regarding those particular fees. He also said, she no longer lives in the area and she lives in fear. So you're allowed to consider that she needs to get away from there. He then went on to discuss the issue paper and the 4 different types of damages that they were going to see on that issue paper. He said, in relation to the law, he said he will discuss it, but he said disregard anything he gets wrong. The judge will guide him, and anything I say is subject to correction by the judge. So he said there was 4 different types of damages that they would see. He said there'd be general damages. He said these were about compensating the person for the assault, for the event itself, for the pain and suffering and the consequences of the event. The fact she's never been able to get back to work, she's not able for a career and she carries this with her forever. He then says there were special damages in relation to medical expenses. There was another set of damages in relation to the loss of earnings to date and the loss of earnings in the future. He did summarise all of the prior evidence given by the vocational assessor, the actuary and her previous employer, Mr. John McMahon. all in relation to that loss of earnings to date and in the future. And he also said that the evidence of her GP, Dr. Clark, was also relevant because this evidence on day 5, he summarised all of their evidence and corroborated the fact that she had PTSD. And he spent quite a bit of time doing that, but that's all evidence we've discussed in detail in previous episodes. The fourth one, he said, was special damages. So he said these are aggravated damages, and he said these are damages which are on top of the general damages which mark the circumstances in which the assault took place. He said the conduct of the defendants, that he said in itself was aggravated damages. He said when he was a law student, there was an example. He said if you're at home in your kitchen and somebody hits you, it's assault. If you sue them, it's assault. If you sue them for compensation, it's assault. But if you're at the mart, surrounded by your peers and friends, and if somebody hits you, it's aggravated because you've been humiliated in front of them. I then went on to reference a case of Connery versus the Irish National Teachers Association in the early 1990s and gave a specific definition in relation to aggravated damages. He also went on to define it then as well.
So, Clodagh, these are damages that can be given to her on top of that sort of mathematical sum that these experts have come up on about, which is her loss of earnings, what she could earn in the future, and that was to do with PTSD and other reasons why she couldn't work.
Yes, exactly. And then there's another bit of damages that are set out on the charge sheet, and he said this is not compensation in relation to Nikita Hand, but he said it's a punishment by it's a punitive exemplary damages. He said this compensation by which the court expresses disapproval at the manner the defendant has conducted himself. He said, we need to be seen to publicly punish the defendant for their conduct. He said, this is your opportunity to express your disapproval of what this man did in a public forum. He then went on to close off his closing statement. He says that for Nikita Hand, the case was overwhelming, embarrassing, but overwhelming. And it was reinforced when Mr. McGregor got into the witness box and decided to reinvent his own evidence. He also went on to say that he built up significant lies. He said the lies became more extravagant. You end up saying things like there was no tampon, she swan dived into the bath, and she was out for 3 days. He said all it does is underline the fact that Mr. McGregor's story from the beginning was unfounded. He said you should indicate the victim and compensate my client. He said you will figure out the fact from the fiction.
And of course that is what this jury are going to have to do. They're likely to be addressed by Justice Alexander Owens, who will explain from his point of view or what he feels he needs to explain to them. And they will essentially, it's not quite a guilty or not guilty in the same way as a criminal case is, because as we've heard during those closing statements, the burden of proof is 51%. So it's probable, if it probably happened. If you're more likely that it did happen than didn't happen, basically by 1%, which is very different to a criminal case. And they will be, it'll be explained to them exactly all these, what compensations they can give should they find in Nikita Hand's favour. The judge will speak to them today for most of the morning, and it's likely then that they will be sent out to deliberate, and nobody's any idea how long that will take. But one way or another, it's likely they'll be back this week at some point with what is the equivalent of a verdict.
Yes.
So it's been a long case. It's gone on for 2 weeks.
Yes. I believe it was due to kind of end around today. The judge had another case in for today. He's actually asked that case to move on to Thursday. So maybe he's hopeful that it will end on Thursday. Maybe that's hopeful. Again, you never know with juries. How long is a piece of string? We don't know what they're thinking again.
And their
deliberations are completely in private. So
they'll essentially be asked whether they believe her or them. I mean, that's a very basic way of putting it. What is the most probable thing that happens? There's 2 things they have to consider. Was she raped by Conor McGregor, and was she raped by James Lawrence? What probably happened. It is a complex case, there's no doubt about it. We've heard all the evidence around memory loss. There was drugs taken. There was a lot of drink taken. This day occurred after a long night. For all of the people involved were out all the night before, and the jury has heard all the evidence around that, and the up and down in the lift and the text messages, etc. So they have quite a bit of work to do. And as I think it was Remy Farrell, senior counsel for Mr. McGregor, said, they have a hard job ahead of them.
Yeah, he said they'd be one of the busiest juries in the country.
Right. Okay, Clodagh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.